Ay, doon na! Chicana.
Hi, I'm Donna Lynn. Welcome to Travel Angel. My guest is Gerardo Aldana, author and professor of Ancient Mesoamerica in the Department of Chicana Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we're doing a series on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula because it's fabulous and there's just so much. Besides Cancun for spring break, there's so much to see and do in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. All of the archaeological sites are just really, I encourage you to go and experience this for yourself. The water is so blue, the sky is so blue. I know you want to go.
And most of what we see is coming from a very specific time period. When you go to Chichén Itzá, when you go to the Yucatec sites, you're looking at stuff from the post-classic. And so there's this misconception that a lot of people have about this collapse of the Maya civilization. All this stuff is after the collapse. And so what you have is during the classic period, before that, all of the cities that were really doing well, most of them seem to be happening in Guatemala or in southern Mexican Yucatec Peninsula, or like in Chiapas, in northern Honduras. So that southern region, relative to Yucatan Peninsula, was really the classic heartland. And it's true that a lot of those sites were abandoned right around 900 AD. And this is what people thought at first it was a collapse of the entire civilization. They all disappeared. What happened to them? Maybe there was a drought. Maybe there was aliens who kind of picked them up. Who knows? But what we have in the archaeological record is it looks like a lot of people stayed at a lot of these sites. So you would have a city like Copan in Honduras, and the everyday people, they said, we're not going anywhere. People can take off, but we're going to stay here. And they lived and they went back to their more conservative farming techniques. But the elite, the people with money, the people in power, those are the ones who seem to have left from all of the classic sites. And they moved up north.
Where?
To the Yucatan Peninsula. So at the end of the classic period, people leave the south and they move to the north. And that's why the post-classic is so big in the north, because the elite, the people with money, the people who were trading, the people with connections, they moved to the north to make that area flourish.
When we're talking about north, where are we specific?
We're talking about Chichén Itzá, we're talking about Uxmal, we're talking about Cobá, Tulum. Those are the ones that become important. And so if you look at where they're located, for my money, you must have had a political crisis along the Usumacinta River, which goes right through the heart of Guatemala. And so that used to be, like in the classic period, that was where trade happened. Okay, everybody was getting their stuff in and out of the Maya area through the Usumacinta. But there was also a lot of fighting between the cities because they wanted control of the trade. So if you get to the point where it's no longer fun from the outside to trade with people through the Usumacinta, then you just go around the outside. And all of a sudden you start to see movement and cities around the northern area. So I think it was more of a trade collapse, an economic collapse on that level than anything having to do with some massive drought or some intervention by extraterrestrials.
Because there's so many rumors that, what happened to the Mayans, what happened to the Aztecs? Yeah. There were these brilliant civilizations that built all these fabulous pyramids and structures, and all of a sudden they just vanished, like aliens, outer space. Venus, it was the Venusians.
Oh yeah, that's right. They just jumped on the raft and then went with Quetzalcoatl to Venus. Could be.
But I saw for myself. I mean, the Mayans are alive and well. I mean, they're in Cancun. They're all through the Yucatan Peninsula. They're in South and Central America, and your studies are Mesoamerica.
And there are indigenous populations throughout Mexico, but it's in many ways they're the kind of ethnic conflicts in Mexico that we have in the United States, right? Where you have misrepresentations of different populations. We're not demographically equal. So you have the same thing in Mexico. A lot of it has to do with indigenous versus non-indigenous people.
So the Mayans are these super cool, super smart people who astronomically, scientifically, mathematically figured out Fibonacci numbers and integer zero numbers and built pyramids and pyramidal inches that have the same dimensions that go for the radius of the Earth to the sun. And they did this all without tools, using obsidian stones, maybe.
And they calculated that the end of the world would be in December 21st, 2012. You can add that to the list because it all turns out to be, you know, fanciful interpretation of the archaeological evidence that we have. You have very clear examples in different areas of a standard unit of measure, but it's a standard unit of measure that varies from one site to another. Just like way back in Europe, you would have people measuring things by arm spans or hand spans. So yes, of course they had units of measure, but it wasn't something connected to the fabric of the universe. It was something that was useful at the time. This whole fascination with 2012 is wrong for a whole heck of a lot of reasons. One of them shows up at Koba itself. So the site of Koba is fascinating for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that it has a really long occupation. It thrived during the Classic period, and it thrived into the post-Classic period.
Now, for our audience, could you please just differentiate, like the time there's pre-Classic, there's Classic, there's
Right.
post-Classic, there's pre-Columbian, so people get a little confused.
Yeah, so the pre-Classic goes all the way back to about 2000 BC, and that's the transition from the Archaic period. The Archaic period is when people are really living hunter-gatherer kind of lives, or they're in one place because that place is so rich with resources that they don't have to move around, right? So if you live at a river mouth, you can harvest stuff from the sea, you can get stuff from the river, you can get stuff from the forest, you have everything at your hands, you don't need to move around.
Chichén Itzá?
Right, so that's the Archaic period. Then you transition into the pre-Classic when you start to get the first settlements where they're building architecture, and that's happening, you know, 1500 BC to about 800 BC. And then things start to really kick off, and you get some massive cities like El Mirador in the pre-Classic still, so that's a couple hundred years BC. That all leads up to what we now call the Classic period that goes from around 300 AD to 900 AD. That's the Classic period where you get the sites like Palenque, Tikal, Copan, Calakmul, those major cities in the southern region. Then you get to the post-Classic where you find the stuff in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, and that starts around 1000 AD and goes up to the time of contact.
Is contact like Cortez?
Contact
or?
is well, a little bit earlier, so 1492,
Okay,
1519-ish, yeah, that time period, when you have contact across the Atlantic, pretty clearly documented. So those are the periods we're talking about. A lot of what's going on in the Yucatan Peninsula is evidence of post-Classic. Stuff southern is from the Classic period. Koba kind of straddles both, and it has evidence from both periods.
No.
And it has this really fascinating stela that has
Many.
a reference to what people talk about as the creation date of the Mayan Long Count calendar.
Which was 5,000 years ago?
Which is the one that people connect to 3114 BC.
Which is supposed to end on December 21st this year,
which
2012.
is supposed to produce this cycle that then ends 2012. And so this one stela has information about that, the way they thought of that date, as opposed to how modern popular culture has changed that and turned it into something completely else. I would say one of the biggest misconceptions about the whole 2012 stuff is the idea that there was a 13 Baktun cycle. So this cycle of, so the Baktun is a period of time, right? It's a period of time of about 400 years, like 394. So if you have 13 of those, you're talking about 5,200 years. That's where you get the supposed 5,200 year cycle. Now there's a couple of inscriptions, only a few in the whole Maya area, that record when this long count started, what its zero date was. And to get to that zero date, they did something a little bit funky. This stuff around the zero date, when their long count started, instead of writing it as all zeros, they wrote it as the end of a 13th Baktun, and then everything else was zero. And so then they went from there to the first. So it was like the 13 reset itself. So it effectively acted like a zero. So a lot of people have misunderstood this to mean that every time that thing comes to a 13, it's going to reset to zero and it's going to start everything all over again. But we have very clear inscriptions that the Maya themselves wrote. Mayan scribes who wrote this 13 ending in ancient times also wrote what was going to happen in the future, and they did not reset it. So there was no 13 Baktun cycle. It was a one-time event. Happened, they recorded it, and then they moved on from there. And the Koba stela has a really fanciful numerological record of that date, because they give you the 13, all the zeros, but then they give you 20 other 13s of larger periods that's all a part of. They're showing you it's this huge cosmic, numerologically wild time, but that was that one-off event. It's not supposed to happen every 13 Baktuns.
Koba's a fascinating site. There's many stelae there. They're weathered, so it's really hard, and especially you need to be able to read hieroglyphics.
Which is a challenge, right? I mean, it's a fascinating story how we came to be able to read Mayan hieroglyphic writing. And it's only really within the last 10 to 15 years that we can be very confident with our readings. The stuff from the 70s, 80s, and maybe even some of the early 90s was a little more speculative. But scholars now have gotten to the point where they get the grammar, they get the syntax, they get the whole ball of wax. And so now when we read a text, we're reading it the way they would have read it back then.
Yeah, Koba, they have that beehive pyramid, which is like the church, and then there's a really larger pyramid structure where there's like
Massive
this giant
one.
rope. It was
Right.
really fun to climb.
And all next to the lake, right? So
yes, the
you can
crocodile
see
lake. And the lakes, the lagoons are connected.
And so in many ways, so much of the architecture in Yucatan is connected to these water sources, right? Whether they're cenotes or natural lakes, of which there are relatively few.
And when you go to Koba, it's really fun. You need to either rent a bicycle or they have choices. Either you can walk, and it's so many acres, it's like you wouldn't be able to really see everything. So it's really good to rent a bicycle, or even they have people that will bicycle you around if you're too lazy to ride your own bicycle.
And it's still next to a relatively small village, so it's not the tourist manicured kind of site that you would find at Chichén Itzá or at even Mayapan, which is now becoming more of a tourist attraction.
And there's many stelae at Koba, and there's a stele under secured where nobody can touch it or anything. Maybe it's that stele that you're talking about with all the interesting hieroglyphics and the codex.
But what's nice about it as well is that you get a sense of the natural environment, what it was like to live in a Mayan world, and which is a lot of what they're trying to preserve with the bioreserves at Lake Siancan, what they're doing in the Lacandon forest further south in Mexico. They have reserves in Belize and Guatemala. Everywhere they're trying to find spaces where they can preserve the rainforest. And when we see it, we see the same kind of world that the ancient Maya were living in before they started to build their
So much of
cities.
Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula is jungle, and it's fabulous. And it's so easy to go to Koba. It really is. I mean, from Cancun, it's an hour bus ride from Cancun to Playa del Carmen. Tulum is 1 hour past Playa del Carmen, and the Koba site is really close to Tulum. So you could do Koba one day and Tulum the next. Tulum is fabulous because it's the archaeological site on the water, and that was their port for commerce.
And you can see the beachhead where the large seafaring canoes would have just come up and emptied everything out, and then they go right up onto the plaza. You have this beautiful structure that just sits right on the very edge and overlooking the turquoise waters. It's a fantastic site.
It's beautiful, and people spend a lot of time enjoying the beach area. And I think the sea turtles nest there.
Maybe. I don't know about that. But there's some amazing murals there. So we haven't talked at all about the whole mural tradition in the Maya
please.
area.
There's the Temple of Murals. And so please, what is the mural tradition?
Right. So it changes a little bit in the post-classic, but we have murals that go all the way back to Bonampak, for example, on the classic site. But the one that's caused the most news lately has been the discovery at San Bartolo of these pre-classic murals. So this is also in the Yucatan Peninsula in the northern area, but it's extremely early. It's like 100 AD. And it shows a lot of the same ideas that we